Do you struggle with fighting in ranked and tournaments? Today, I'm going to be going through the fundamentals of fighting in Fortnite. This video will be in chronological order from early to late game. Let's get started. Starting with early game, there are three fundamental concepts to win early game fights: loot, mats, and height or position. Off-spawn fights are the scrappiest fights through the whole game and rely first off on your loot. Having a shotgun when your opponent doesn't, or 100 shield advantage, is enough to change the entire trajectory of a fight and transcends the skill of your opponent. The easiest way to ensure you have the loot to beat any player off spawn is by getting a drop map and a loot route. A drop map is a set of markers that you can deploy your glider on to ensure that you have the best drop for the place you land. A loot route is a set path and routine you take once you land to ensure maximum efficiency when looting and farming. If you can have a high priority spot in your POI with a set route to maximize the loot you can get, you have a much higher chance at outlooting your opponent, which nets you a huge advantage in an initial confrontation. The second early game concept is mats. Mats give you the flexibility to outplay your opponent even if you're losing in other fundamentals. They're incorporated into the loot route. You should find out what things you can farm that have the most efficient HP to material ratio. Farming tiny one-hit things that only give around 5 materials is a big waste of time. You want to find things that have good HP that give 10 or more material per swing. The more mats you have, the more potential and higher ceiling you have to outplay the person contesting you. The final off-spawn fundamental for winning off-spawn is position. You want to ensure that you prioritize landing on the power position of your POI. Your loot route and drop mat should put you in the spot that dominates over everyone else. Usually this means the spot with the height advantage, and then the advantage in the two categories I mentioned earlier, mats and loot. If you combine all these things and have all these advantages over your opponent, no matter who it is, it should ensure a very good chance at winning off-spawn engagements every game. The next phase of the game is mid-game. Mid-game fights vary greatly, so I'll separate them into offensive fights and defensive fights. First off, to determine which fight it is, if it's not obvious, generally a fight that's offensive starts because you get a beam or initial damage on someone. It could also happen if they have something you want, like an island claim or cash. For offensive fights, the most important thing is trying to create as much initial damage as possible. Starting with damage gives you the initiative to create plays. In duos, creating pinches by attacking from two different angles is highly efficient for getting more damage and finishing fights. In solos, creating pressure and going for pre-piece is the most effective strategy for winning fights. I have a whole video dedicated to this if you want a more in-depth guide. It's also very important to know when to 50-50. You have to assess your surroundings in order to determine whether or not it's a good idea to jump in. Jumping in is the fastest way to end a fight if you have a damage advantage, but if there's someone else in the vicinity, you can get stuck in their builds and die. Also, if you don't have heals, you can be left with low HP and be susceptible to a third party killing you later before you can look for heals. Meds wise, for offensive fights, you want medkits and bigs as they are quick and can get you to 200 HP. Medallions are also super important if you're going for a key game. You want to collect as many as possible to give you an advantage, but also make sure any good teams in your game are taken out early to ensure you get as many kills as possible. For defensive fights, the most important concept is making space. Making multiple boxes to work out of is the best way to ensure you don't die quickly. You also have to be careful when making new boxes that you don't get pre-pieced. Once you have multiple boxes to play out of, it makes it much easier to get heals off and take safe angles. If you're constantly pressured so you can't heal, you need to keep making boxes until your original ones are fully built so you can circle back to them and get your heals off. Another important concept in defensive fighting is counter damage. Counter damage is the only other way to get your heals off against a good player. If you notice they're over-aggressing or in your builds, you can create a right hand to get damage that can't be reciprocated. After this, you'll both have to heal. What sometimes happens if you get counter damage is that they continue aggressing, in which case you might have to take another shot to finish the fight. The most important thing when you're fighting with low HP is to take perfect peeks. I'll go more in depth about peeks at the end of the video. The final time you can get in a fight is late game. There are two main concepts I want to talk about in late game. First off, you have to be aware of the lobby's attention. If you're going to fight, you have to be sure that the one that's going to be sprayed by the whole lobby is your enemy and not you. If you play around the builds correctly, you can have the rest of the lobby help you win the fight. The side where the least amount of people are is usually where you want to take the fights from. This is often the side with Storm. The other thing that attracts the lobby's attention is fresh builds. You want to make sure your builds are fully done building before initiating the fight. The way you can use this to your advantage is by taking someone else's builds and forcing them to rebox. You can get the lobby to start spraying them, especially if you force them out towards the rest of the lobby. The second part of endgame fighting is that it's mostly attention based. Since the zones are moving, there is a ticking timer on how long each interaction can last. If someone is aware of you, it makes your chance of having a successful encounter much lower. If you can catch someone off guard, it gives you one chance to end the fight immediately. Endgame is the easiest part of the game to find someone who's unaware because there's so much going around that people focus their attention on. Once someone finds that you're trying to make a play on them, unless you absolutely need it, you should try to find another target. The best ways to catch your opponents unaware are by pickaxing their walls while they heal, jumping in through their edited wall while they're scouting or shooting someone, jumping in while they're healing, or pre-editing them while they aren't looking in your direction. Finally, the last thing I have to talk about are peaks. In order to create a damage advantage or fight while you're low, you need to create perfect peaks. The first thing I want to note is that just because an edit is regarded as a right hand peak doesn't mean it's always going to be. This window, or this peanut butter edit, can be a good right hand peak, but if you dry peek it, which means you have no movement, just stand in front of the edit, you'll get shot regardless. When you make edits, you have to have momentum going towards the shielded side of the edit. Good movement is what allows you to take peaks that cannot be traded. You also have to understand the sightlines of your opponent. You can create situations where only you can get damage using edits that generally you wouldn't think were good peaks. Here, you're jumping out of his sightline while still having an angle on his feet. Crosshair placement and peaks are important to think about. If you're edit release, you're going to have to sacrifice your crosshair placement in order to get a good peak, which in turn makes the shot harder to hit. No edit release means that you can train your crosshair on your opponent before you even confirm the edit. Another thing to think about is peeker's advantage. As you can see here, games are desynced. Whoever peeks first is going to have the opportunity to shoot first regardless of whether or not it's a left hand peek. The last thing to think about when peeking is to reset and hold your wall after you take the shot. Oftentimes you can either block the shot or stop them from bleeding bullets through your weak wall. Thank you all for watching, I hope you enjoyed. If you did stick around to the end, drop a comment and I'll try to hide it. No long outros, bye.